Okay, Great Tex in his latest video says we need to discuss the ramifications of certain. I think this is what he's saying, of certain views of will, right up from the outset, or especially in conversations involving will, awareness, and consciousness. So I think I'll try to do that. I got three areas. First of all, working definitions of consciousness, awareness, and will. To me, I mean the same thing by awareness and consciousness. I've agreed to use the word awareness because a lot of you say that consciousness means something extra to you, but basically both of those mean, having first person perceptions. And will is this perception of acting, this feeling of goal oriented behavior that you can act on, try to achieve a goal. Goal pursuing behavior. So, if you want me to distinguish more between awareness and consciousness, and for this thing to stick, me using the word awareness for microbial, well, what would otherwise be microbial consciousness, um, then, define consciousness better. The better you define consciousness, the more I'll see that distinction, right? To me, there's already a distinction. You guys seem to think like a lot of you want to talk about consciousness as self-awareness, but I don't see that. I see that as self-consciousness. To me, awareness and consciousness can have the same meaning in this context. But as I say, if you want me to stick with this, distinction and use awareness for microbial, you know, uh, microbial Cartesian theaters, then define consciousness well. You can't say, well, there is no good definition, but here's how you have to use the word. If you're going to tell me how to use the word, then you're presuming to have a definition. Okay. So a couple of the areas. I think one area where my view of will has an impact is on social activism. One major impact, at least, is on social activism. And when compared to the notion that choice is just an illusion, and it, so I blogged politically for years. I found it a great way to stay involved with politics when you're not in the city, because frankly, a lot of the action is in the urban environment. And in that world, there's an assumption you can make choices. You can policy. You make a choice about a policy, and it has an effect, makes a difference. Okay, and I found there was a lack of philosophy. I thought, hey, these guys need to understand philosophy better. But then when I dig down and find the liberal philosophers, I find they don't even believe in choices. Most of them, it seems like. Okay, and that makes me think that progressive activists lack the good counsel of progressive philosophers, on the grounds that the progressive philosophers think it's impossible to advise as to best choice when it's just an illusion choice. So I think there's an impact on enabling progressive philosophers to start advising and being progressive activists if they believe that there is a power in will, that it adds energy to the total, just like the energy from the sun or a tsunami, there is will. And with engineering and pre-planning, even if it's a weak energy source, it can be made as strong as the former ones, the sun, the tsunamis, the whatnot, through preparation and the fact that we have will 12/7 at least. Okay, another impact that I was surprised to discover is that one issue about consciousness is vegetarianism. Okay, when I was an ethical vegetarian in the past, it was due to the cruelty of big ranching industry, the way they treat chickens and cows. I was not as concerned about eating animals that live well during their life, for example, in the wild, and then get hunted in some non cruel way, a quick death. You don't take animals with young, things like that. To me, that didn't bother me as much. It was this industrial animal slavery ending in death that, possibly a cruel death, but it was the cruel life I was concerned about. On the other hand, I admit, I'm a former vegetarian. Perhaps that view was a lack of real commitment. Perhaps I missed the real reason. Okay, so I grant some credibility to the vegetarian argument to that effect, okay? And I find that some vegetarians pride themselves on not eating, conscious creatures, okay? And in that case, I suspect saying, well, it's a kind of consciousness, I'm just going to call it awareness, won't really change the reasoning. So this is a potential impact. Now, I could see the implications of that, but I still tend at first, I tended at first to miss the impact of this on vegetarians of this mindset, right? I thought there are sufficient distinctions available, right? Eating a conscious being that's not that conscious. You know, you could say it's not really duller. You know, they have thirst and it's real thirst, but it's not like they see you coming. It's stuff on a slower time scale, and they have no pain neurons, which is, you know, responsible at least for the sharpness of our own pain experiences. So to me, I thought, you know, I repeatedly talk about this, the relative dullness of a plant sense, and think that, okay, if the issue is being less cruel to what we ranch and farm and harvest, you know, that can easily be done with plants. Plants are less mobile. They can be given comforts. You know, their harvesting can be very. It's easier to make it on their time scale quick. So I think I felt like, oh, there's a distinction between eating animals and eating plants. It shouldn't really affect the issue of vegetarianism. Okay, because the plants are focused on slower moving phenomena. Do I have water? And its lack of mobility also makes it, you know, it's like if you give it a field, sunlight, fertilizer, it's happy. It's healthy looking. It's flourishing. If you want to tell if it's in a good situation by if it flourishes, it's flourishing. Okay, it's hard to maintain a natural area for 100 cattle. It's easy to do for 100 plants. Okay, but if the notion hinges on the idea that death snuffs out some awareness or a consciousness, then perhaps none of this is comfort. Okay, because if even the paramecium have a little tiny bit of awareness, then it adds credibility to this, you know, life is cannibalism sort of idea. Maybe they don't want to give into that. Now, I say that that's just a part of life. And of course, we give into it. You know, the bacteria are designed to deal with that. If you don't have predation, they self-destruct, basically. You know, they'll just grow crazy. They count on predation. So, to me, it's a more complicated world where there's a symbiosis between what consumes and what is consumed. You know, the bacteria require predation for their design to work, and also these eukaryotic life, they seem to have at some point eaten some bacteria, some microbes that were smaller, and instead of getting digested, they just went to work in a cell, you know, like the mitochondria. So there's this spectrum involves symbiotic relationships. Okay, so I don't feel like I have to look at the world as cannibalism because there's this symbiosis that is uncomfortable at certain times, indistinguishable from cannibalism a lot of the time, but really it's the way the system works, and we as intelligent creatures can definitely, you know, fix ourselves, what I would consider a better situation than your, you know, typical rotifer. All right, now the final thing is crime and punishment. And frankly, I'm glad our discussions on will have not centered on crime and punishment. A lot of discussion on will has been over history distorted by the theistic involvement and the issue of, look, a thief steals from you, we need to punish him. You know, if there's no free will, then there's no real justification for punishing him. You have to punish him for a choice, blah, blah, blah. I don't care. I think that those kind of arguments really have no influence on the will, which it can be studied materially. But it's not true the other way around. What you do decide about will probably affect your view on punishment and whatnot. But it's not going to make it so that you can or cannot punish. It's just going to change how you justify it. Most people feel there should be ramifications forced on people that transgress things like thievery, murder, unjustified violence, you know, non-self-defense violence, and so on. Okay, and how you justify them is going to change based on your definition of will. But if you come up with the justification, that's a separate thing. So, as a relativist, I think it's impossible to find an absolute view on how we should treat each other. and assume there could be acceptance of the potential restrictions on behavior that come from how we should treat each other. However, as even though there's a quid pro quo to it. However, as a skeptic, I do think it's possible for an individual to find a system that one believes in, one's willing to accept, one's willing to say, look, I have these urges, I'll even overcome those in order to, fit with this system. And quid pro quo, okay, when I'm mad at someone, can't just punch them in the face, but then again, they can't do that to me more than fair trade. 100 people can't punch me, I can't punch one or two, three, four people in my life. Okay, that's a good deal. So the issue of crime and punishment is just one of these things that if I decide, I could say, look, if somebody steals from me, I'm going to go do X, Y, and Z. And just like I can just try to find, is there a group of people that think you shouldn't steal? I can ask, is there a group of people that think if you shouldn't, if someone does steal, they should be arrested and separated from the rest of the people? If I find enough people like that, then I can go ahead and try to live that way with them. I think a ramification on a social policy and this crime and punishment issue is that if there is will and we're trying to restrain it as little as possible, then yeah, there's this idea of auto sovereignty, of individual sovereignty. And really, if you can't get to an agreement, you ought to try to compartmentalize. So if people really want to live in some laissez faire government and there's 50 million of them, then give them a little country of their own that's geographically compartmentalized from another place where people want to do that. Or let's say, 20 million people are anti-city. They want to live in a country where you can't build cities. Okay, they might have to move because the only way we compartmentalize or can compartmentalize is geographical in such a situation. But let them move, and then the other people who they would be interfering with that want to build cities can go build cities and they can avoid it. Right now, a belief that there's will in all things, I think, leads to this distributed view where both in the activism side we can use our will to make things better, and on the other side, by acknowledging the wills of others, we can agree that what we really want to do in some sense is create the most free space for all wills to exercise themselves however they like, and to minimize where there has to be a conflict, where we have to interpret a conflict, you know and choose one way or the other. We don't have to make all parks allow dogs or no parks allow dogs. We can have some allow dogs and some don't, and make the proportion in proportion to the amount of people that want to be able to go to a park where there's never dogs and versus those people who want to go where there are dogs or don't care. All right. Cheers.